Hi there. In this video we'll be talking about slavery after the American Revolution. So slavery from, say, 1780, 1790, 1800 on to near its demise in the 1850s and 1860s. So in 1808, the United States banned its citizens from participating in the African slave trade. Now that certainly didn't stop people trading slaves. Slaves were bought and sold up and down the east coast of the United States, especially, and eventually once slave trading was banned in the north, from Washington, D.C. south. So certainly slaves were still being bought and sold. However, banning of the international slave trade, banning Americans from going to Africa or elsewhere and buying slaves from overseas, made a big difference for what the population of people descended from Africa would look like. No longer would their culture be characterized by regular infusions of African culture. Instead, creolization, we remember that's the mixing of cultures, came to a slow end and was replaced by generations of black people who had never known anything but America, that is, African Americans. Now, slavery is one of the richest and most complicated topics for any historian to deal with. But most of the questions that historians have asked about African American slavery in the past 50 years, the ones that keep coming back, especially once we're dealing with enslaved people who were several generations removed from Africa, is this: how did enslaved people in America deal with or respond to their enslavement? Now, by now, you probably won't be surprised to learn that several generations of historians prior to the 1950s and 1960s simply assumed that many slaves didn't mind being enslaved very much. Indeed, some historians even bought slaveholders' racist justifications that slavery helped civilize or Christianize people of African descent. But in the 1960s, that changed. The Civil Rights Movement spurred a long overdue sea change in the way that African Americans were perceived in mainstream American intellectual thought. But simply recognizing that African Americans were capable, strong, and intelligent didn't really clarify the question of how enslaved people responded to their situation. The reason this was such a pressing question is one of the great unsolved mysteries of American history. Why were there so few slave insurrections, and especially so few major revolts in North America? In Latin America, slaves revolted with seeming regularity, yet very few major revolts took place in the United States. So the question of why slaves didn't organize violent resistance in North America has haunted the study of slavery ever since historians finally started taking African Americans seriously. One school of historians that emerged in the 1960s argued that slavery's cruelty wrought severe damage on the African American psyche, decimating family and cultural structures, and ultimately inculcated servility. And some of them made this point in comparison with Latin America. In Latin America, and in places like Haiti, where the most famous slave revolt took place, most slaves lived on very, very large plantations, meaning that whites simply had less control over their day-to-day life. Whereas in North America, many slaves and the majority of slaveholders were small slaveholders. So that meant that a large number of enslaved African Americans lived on small plantations, which allowed whites, the theory goes, to have sort of a more crushing and intrusive influence on their lives, and thus were able to affect and destroy black family structures. And what that notion has led to is an image of slavery very much focused on slaveholder initiative, on the initiative of whites, and meanwhile on the notion of African Americans essentially doing what they were told. So here's an African American servant slave of a white Confederate soldier. Some historians found or argued that African Americans essentially acted as they were told, and in fact came up with responses to their enslavement that didn't necessarily express their own willpower or autonomy. But other historians have taken issue with those arguments, arguing, for instance, in contrast, that enslaved African Americans actually preserved surprisingly stable home and family lives. And as for the lack of slave revolts, these historians have done impressive work, A, looking at the extraordinarily complex methods of control that masters employed, and B, examining evidence in new ways. Most significantly, these historians have discerned, in moments where whites saw only laziness or incompetence or perhaps damaged psyches and intelligences, they've discerned sophisticated patterns, if not of outright revolt, but of resistance. Once historians started looking for resistance rather than mere revolt, they found slaves who wouldn't or couldn't risk outright revolution, and instead did a multitude of things to make slavery less profitable for their masters and more palatable for themselves and their families, asserting their own sense of autonomy or free will. African Americans routinely shirked work responsibilities. They ran away for short periods of time, just short enough that their families wouldn't necessarily pay retribution, and they stole little luxuries for themselves. They also, as historians have documented, developed a rich cultural life that frequently satirized whites' pretensions to mastery. Still, I want you to think about the question of resistance, revolt, and slavery's psychological effects. What does the evidence you see suggest? Were these people, who were under enormous psychological and physical pressure, stunted in their human development? Or did they maintain some autonomy, some personal identity, a sense of personal and familial strength throughout their ordeal? And what are the political consequences of arguing either way? The other big question you might consider, now but also increasingly as we move forward, is whether slavery had much of a future, or more to the point, whether it was profitable. The question has all sorts of implications, but the most basic implication is this: if it wasn't profitable, then maybe slavery would have eventually died out of its own accord. That is what many defenders of slavery actually said for a long time. They said, we don't need to ban it. It's going to be replaced by free labor eventually. And that is certainly what many of the founding fathers appear to have professed to hope and believe, that slavery might just be a temporary evil that could eventually be gotten rid of. But if slavery was profitable, especially as the institution moved west, then Southern whites might be much less willing to give it up. This will matter more and more as we approach the Civil War.